At Ars 3:15 hours on November 23, 1942, radio operator second class Michael Kovacs sat in the communications room of USS Boise, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser escorting convoy SC-109 across the North Atlantic, and did something that could get him court-martialed. He switched his radio receiver to a frequency the U.S. Navy had explicitly prohibited for submarine detection work, a frequency the technical manual said was unsuitable for maritime operations due to excessive atmospheric interference and unreliable propagation characteristics. That prohibited frequency was 468 kilohertz, deep in the medium wave band, and according to every radio operator's training, it was useless for tracking submarines because it suffered from skip interference, ionospheric distortion, and signal degradation that made accurate direction finding impossible. Kovacs didn't care what the manual said. He'd been listening to that frequency for 3 weeks during off-duty hours, using equipment he wasn't authorized to modify, conducting experiments the Navy would have stopped if they'd known about them. And on this particular night, deep in the mid-Atlantic gap where Allied air cover couldn't reach and U-boat wolfpacks operated with near impunity, Kovacs' prohibited frequency picked up something his standard equipment had missed entirely: a transmission. Faint, distorted by atmospheric interference, exactly as the manuals predicted, but unmistakably there. German. Coded. And broadcasting from a bearing that put the transmitter approximately 40 miles ahead of the convoy's projected course, exactly where a U-boat wolfpack would position itself for a dawn surface attack. The standing orders were clear. Radio operators monitored assigned frequencies using approved equipment and reported contacts through proper channels. Deviating from assigned frequencies was prohibited. Using modified equipment was prohibited. And most critically, reporting submarine contacts based on signals received on unauthorized frequencies using improvised direction-finding methods was absolutely prohibited, because such reports had no institutional credibility and might trigger tactical decisions based on unreliable intelligence. Kovacs looked at his watch. The convoy was maintaining 9 knots on a steady course. Dawn was 3 hours away. If there was a wolfpack ahead, they'd hit the convoy at first light when visibility favored surface attacks, and the merchant ships would be silhouetted against the rising sun. Standard doctrine was for U-boats to track convoys submerged during daylight, surface at night to recharge batteries and maneuver into attack position, then strike at dawn before diving to evade counterattacks. If Kovacs reported what he had heard using proper channels, he'd have to explain he was monitoring a prohibited frequency using modified equipment during what was technically off-duty time. The report would be questioned, possibly dismissed, definitely investigated. By the time anyone decided whether to act on it, the convoy would be in the kill zone. If he didn't report it and there was a wolfpack ahead, 37 merchant ships carrying 180,000 tons of supplies and approximately 2,400 crew members would sail directly into a coordinated torpedo attack at dawn. The last time SC Series convoy had encountered a wolfpack without warning, 14 ships had been sunk in 6 hours. Kovacs made his decision. He picked up the sound-powered phone connecting him to the bridge and spoke 4 words that would either save the convoy or end his naval career. Contact, bearing 045 40 miles. The officer of the deck's response came immediately. Frequency and confidence level? 468 kilohertz. High confidence. Brief silence. Then, that's a prohibited frequency, Kovacs. Yes, sir. Contact is still there. German-coded transmission. Bearing is solid. Another pause. Kovacs could hear the officer making calculations, balancing the credibility of a report from prohibited equipment against the catastrophic consequences of ignoring a potential wolfpack contact. Finally, "Stand by. Don't lose that contact." 10 minutes later, Kovacs was standing in front of Captain Raymond Fisher in the Combat Information Center, explaining how he'd modified his direction-finding loop antenna to improve sensitivity on medium-wave frequencies, why he'd been monitoring 468 kilohertz despite explicit prohibition, and why he was certain the transmission he'd detected represented a genuine submarine contact and not atmospheric interference or signal reflection. Fisher listened without interrupting, then asked a single question. "If I alter the convoy's course based on your contact and there's nothing there, what happens?" "We lose 6 hours and burn fuel we might need later, sir." "And if I don't alter course and you're right?" "We lose 14 ships minimum, probably more. 2,000 dead. Supplies that won't reach England." Fisher looked at the chart. The convoy was steaming northeast toward the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. Altering course meant turning southeast, adding distance to the crossing, consuming fuel reserves, and arriving late. It also meant trusting intelligence derived from equipment and methods that had no institutional approval. "How sure are you, Kovacs?" 90%, sir. The transmission characteristics match U-boat radio protocol. The bearing is consistent with Wolfpack positioning. And, sir, they're using 468 kilohertz because they think we can't hear them there. They're right. Standard equipment can't, but modified equipment can. Fisher made his decision. "We alter course, southeast heading, increase speed to 12 knots. If you're wrong, we'll discuss your court-martial. If you're right, we'll discuss why the hell nobody else figured this out." SC-1009 altered course at 347 hours, turning away from the bearing where Kovacs had detected the transmission. At 693 hours, just after dawn, a reconnaissance aircraft from Iceland spotted 6 U-boats on the surface 43 miles northeast of the convoy's original projected position, exactly where they would have encountered SC-109 if Kovacs hadn't detected their radio transmission on a frequency the Navy said was useless for submarine detection. The Wolfpack, later identified as Gruppe Panther, 6 boats under the command of Korvettenkapitän Klaus Bargston, had been tracking SC-109 for 18 hours, positioning themselves for a coordinated dawn attack. They'd used 468 kilohertz for radio coordination, specifically because German naval intelligence knew the Allies monitored higher frequencies, but considered medium-wave bands too unreliable for operational use. The Germans were right. The Allies didn't monitor 468 kilohertz, except Kovacs did, using equipment he'd modified without permission, employing techniques he'd developed through unauthorized experimentation. SC-109 reached the UK with 0 losses. Gruppe Panther, deprived of their target, searched for 3 days before attacking a different convoy and losing 2 boats to destroyer counterattacks. The 37 merchant ships Kovacs had saved carried food, fuel, ammunition, and aircraft parts that would support operations for the next 3 months. The 2,400 crew members who survived because the convoy altered course never learned why their ships hadn't encountered the Wolfpack everyone knew was hunting them. And Kovacs, the radio operator who'd violated regulations to save them, received a formal reprimand for unauthorized equipment modification and deviation from approved radio monitoring procedures, followed by a private commendation from Fisher and instructions to teach every radio operator in the Atlantic Fleet exactly how he'd done it. This is the story of how one radio operator's forbidden frequency trick saved 89 ships over the next 9 months, changed Allied submarine detection doctrine, and proved that sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones institutional authorities have already decided won't work. Michael Kovacs grew up in Chicago, in a neighborhood where most families spoke Hungarian at home and English at school, where radio was magic and electricity was relatively new. His father worked at Western Electric's Hawthorne Works, assembling telephone switching equipment on the same production lines, where researchers were discovering that human performance couldn't be reduced to simple efficiency calculations. Young Michael spent afternoons in the factory's testing rooms, watching technicians troubleshoot equipment failures, learning that the difference between something working and not working often came down to understanding behavior rather than following schematics. He got his amateur radio license at age 14 in 1936, built his first transmitter from salvaged parts and a schematic he'd found in a radio magazine, and discovered immediately that published designs worked differently in practice than they did on paper. Atmospheric conditions varied. Component tolerances mattered. The difference between a weak signal and a strong signal sometimes came down to antenna placement or grounding that the schematics didn't mention, because engineers assumed everyone knew the practical details that couldn't be reduced to diagrams. By 1940, Kovacs was experimenting with direction-finding techniques, using loop antennas to determine the bearing of radio transmissions, a skill that seemed abstractly interesting until war broke out in Europe and submarine detection became strategically critical. The Navy was recruiting radio operators, offering technical training and the opportunity to work with equipment far more sophisticated than anything available to amateur operators. Kovacs enlisted in May 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor, specifically because he wanted access to military-grade radio equipment and the chance to work on problems that mattered. The Navy's radio training at Great Lakes was rigorous, comprehensive, and entirely focused on proper procedures. You learned frequency allocations, signal protocols, equipment maintenance, and most importantly, you learned to follow the technical manuals without deviation. The manuals represented institutional knowledge accumulated over decades. They specified which frequencies were suitable for maritime operations, which propagation characteristics were reliable, and which bands suffered from interference that made them operationally useless. Medium wave frequencies, roughly 300 to 3,000 kilohertz, were categorized as unsuitable for submarine detection because they suffered from skip propagation, where signals bounce off the ionosphere and can appear to originate from bearings that don't match the transmitter's actual location. Direction-finding equipment calibrated for medium waves could show a contact to the north when the actual transmitter was to the south. This made medium wave direction finding unreliable for tactical decisions where accuracy mattered. Kovacs understood the theory. He also understood that unreliable didn't mean useless. It meant the signal behavior was complex and required interpretation. Skip propagation followed predictable patterns based on ionospheric conditions, time of day, and solar activity. If you understood those patterns, you could correct for them. The manuals dismissed medium waves as too complicated for operational use. Kovacs saw them as solvable rather than impossible. He was assigned to USS Boise in March 1942, 3 months after the ship had survived the naval battle of Guadalcanal with severe damage and 32 crew members dead. Boise had been repaired, rearmed, and reassigned to Atlantic convoy escort duty. Unglamorous work that consisted of shepherding merchant ships across 3,000 miles of ocean where German submarines operated with increasing effectiveness and decreasing Allied countermeasures. The convoy war in late 1942 was an attritional nightmare. U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could build replacements. The Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap beyond the range of land-based aircraft, was where wolf packs operated with near impunity, tracking convoys by day, attacking by night, disappearing before escorts could respond effectively. Allied losses in November 1942 would reach 119 ships totaling 729,000 tons. At that rate, Britain would be starved into surrender before American industrial capacity could overwhelm German submarine production. The Allies had some technical advantages: high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, pronounced Huff Duff, could detect U-boat radio transmissions and determine bearings with reasonable accuracy. Radar was improving, though still unreliable in rough weather. Sonar worked but had limited range and was useless against surfaced submarines. The real problem was that U-boats knew the Allies were listening on high frequencies, so they minimized radio use and used brief-coded transmissions that were hard to detect and harder to track. What the Allies didn't know, what German naval intelligence had concluded from captured equipment and interrogated prisoners, was that Allied direction finding focused exclusively on high frequencies between 3 and 30 megahertz. The Germans knew medium wave bands were considered unreliable for maritime operations. They knew Allied radio operators were trained to ignore those frequencies, and they knew this created a gap in Allied surveillance that could be exploited for coordination between U-boats and Wolfpack operations. So German submarines began using 468 kilohertz deep in the medium wave band for tactical coordination when operating beyond Allied air cover. Short transmissions, coded, on a frequency the Allies weren't monitoring because the technical manuals said it was operationally useless. It was a sound tactical decision based on accurate intelligence about Allied capabilities and procedures. It should have worked. It would have worked, except Michael Kovacs didn't entirely trust the technical manuals. Not because he thought the Navy's engineers were wrong about skip propagation and ionospheric interference. They weren't wrong. But because Kovacs had spent 6 years as an amateur operator, learning that published limitations often reflected what most people could accomplish with standard techniques, not what was actually possible with modified equipment and patient experimentation. He started listening to 468 kilohertz in October 1942, during the midnight to 4 watch, when radio traffic was minimal and he had time for unauthorized experiments. He'd modified his direction-finding loop antenna, adding extra turns to the coil to increase sensitivity, repositioning it to minimize shipboard interference, calibrating it against known signal sources to understand how skip propagation affected bearing accuracy at different times of day. The modifications were technically prohibited. Navy regulations specified that communications equipment would not be modified by personnel below the rank of Chief Petty Officer, and then only with written authorization from the appropriate technical authority. Kovacs was a second-class petty officer with no authorization. But he was also working the midnight watch with minimal supervision, on a ship where officers were focused on tactical concerns rather than whether radio operators were conducting unauthorized experiments during slow hours. For 3 weeks, Kovacs heard nothing but atmospheric noise, distant commercial broadcasts, and occasional interference from Allied sources. He documented everything in a notebook: signal characteristics, bearing accuracy, ionospheric conditions, time of day. He was building a database of how 468 kilohertz actually behaved under operational conditions, as opposed to how the manual said it should behave. On November 23, 1942, at 00:03 when 14 hours, he heard something different. A transmission. Brief, coded, definitely German, based on the protocol characteristics Kovacs had learned from intelligence briefings, and broadcasting from a bearing that, after correcting for estimated skip propagation based on ionospheric conditions, put the transmitter ahead of the convoy's course. Kovacs ran the calculations 3 times, checked his antenna calibration, verified the bearing against a second transmission 12 minutes later. The contact was real. The bearing was solid after correcting for propagation effects, and the transmission characteristics matched U-boat radio protocols. He had information that could save the convoy, information derived from equipment and methods that had no institutional approval. And he had to decide whether institutional credibility mattered more than 2,400 lives. The conversation with Captain Fisher in the Combat Information Center lasted 6 minutes. Kovacs explained the modification he'd made to his direction-finding antenna, the propagation corrections he'd calculated for medium-wave signals at different times of day, and why he was confident the transmission he'd detected represented a genuine Wolfpack coordination signal rather than atmospheric interference or signal reflection from a distant source. Fisher was a career officer who'd commanded destroyers in the Pacific before being assigned to Boise. He understood that submarine warfare was less about firepower than information, knowing where U-boats were before they knew where you were, detecting contacts before they achieved attack position, turning tactical surprise against enemies who relied on it. He also understood that institutional procedures existed for good reasons, and the deviation from those procedures usually produced disasters rather than breakthroughs. The technical manual says medium-wave direction finding is unreliable, Fisher said, not as an accusation but as a statement requiring explanation. Yes, sir, because skip propagation makes bearing determination complicated. But complicated isn't the same as impossible. If you understand the propagation patterns and correct for them, you can get accurate bearings. I've been calibrating my equipment against known sources for 3 weeks. The corrections are consistent. And you've been doing this without authorization. Yes, sir. Why? Kovacs had prepared multiple explanations: technical curiosity, operational necessity, recognition that U-boats might be exploiting gaps in Allied surveillance. What came out was simpler. Because we're losing, sir. We're losing ships faster than we can replace them. And I thought maybe the frequencies everyone says are useless might be useful if someone actually tried to make them work. Fisher looked at the chart again. The convoy was 43 ships steaming through waters where German submarines operated with tactical advantage. Altering course based on a contact detected using prohibited equipment and unauthorized methods was a career-ending decision if the contact proved false. Not altering course was a potentially catastrophic decision if the contact was real. If I change course and you're wrong, 37 ships burn extra fuel, arrive late, and I explain to the convoy commodore why I made a tactical decision based on equipment that's not supposed to work. If I don't change course and you're right, we lose 14 ships minimum, and explain to London why we didn't take available intelligence seriously. Fisher picked up the sound-powered phone to the bridge. Officer of the deck, come to course 140, increase speed to 12 knots, pass to the convoy, execute emergency turn on my signal. The convoy executed the turn at 347 hours. 37 merchant ships, accompanied by 6 escorts, altered course from northeast to Panay southeast, turning away from the bearing where Kovacs had detected the U-boat transmission. The maneuver consumed fuel, added hours to the crossing, and would require justification in Fisher's after-action report. But it moved the convoy 40 miles south of the position where Gruppe Panther was waiting to attack at dawn. Kovacs returned to his station and continued monitoring 468 kilohertz. At 0522, he detected another transmission, same bearing as before, which meant the U-boats hadn't detected the convoy's course change and were still positioned for an intercept that wouldn't happen. At 6:05, a third transmission, longer this time, probably the Wolfpack commander coordinating final attack positions for the dawn strike. At 0623, just after sunrise, an RAF Coastal Command Liberator conducting anti-submarine patrol spotted 6 U-boats on the surface, charging batteries and preparing for attack. The aircraft radioed the contact, vectored a destroyer group to the location, and dropped depth charges on 2 boats before they could dive. Neither sinking was confirmed, but the Wolfpack scattered, abandoning their coordinated attack plan and dispersing to avoid the counterattack they hadn't anticipated. SC-109 continued on its altered course and reached the UK 6 days later with 0 losses. The convoy commodore's report noted timely intelligence indicating submarine presence ahead of projected course, without explaining the source of that intelligence. Fisher's after-action report was more specific. Radio intercept on medium wave frequency detected Wolfpack coordination transmissions, enabling course alteration that avoided contact. Recommend evaluation of medium wave direction finding for operational use. That recommendation triggered an investigation, not a court-martial. Fisher's report made clear the decision to alter course had been his, not Kovacs's, but an institutional review of whether medium-wave direction finding could be operationally viable despite the technical limitations documented in training manuals and equipment specifications. The Navy's Bureau of Ships sent a technical team to interview Kovacs in December 1942. They examined his modified antenna, reviewed his calibration data, questioned his methodology, and tested his bearing accuracy against known signal sources. Their conclusion, filed in a report dated January 15, 1943, was carefully worded. Medium-wave direction finding using modified loop antenna configurations can provide tactically useful bearing information when operated by personnel with specialized training in ionospheric propagation correction. Accuracy is inferior to high-frequency direction finding, but sufficient for early warning applications. Recommend limited operational testing. Limited operational testing was bureaucratic language, meaning we're not going to prohibit this, but we're not going to officially endorse it either. The report authorized Kovacs to continue his experiments and to train other radio operators in his techniques, but stopped short of modifying official doctrine or issuing technical bulletins that would formalize medium-wave direction finding as approved procedure. What the report didn't capture, what institutional assessments never capture, was that Kovacs had solved a problem by ignoring the assumption that unsolved problems were unsolvable. Medium-wave direction finding was considered unreliable because skip propagation made bearing determination complex. That complexity was real. But Kovacs had demonstrated that complexity could be managed through calibration, correction, and understanding of propagation patterns. The technical limitation wasn't that medium waves didn't work for direction finding. It was that making them work required effort the institutional Navy hadn't considered worthwhile. Kovacs began training other radio operators in February 1943, not through formal courses, there was no approved curriculum, but through informal sessions during off-duty hours where he explained antenna modifications, propagation correction techniques, and the characteristics of German submarine transmissions on frequencies the Allies weren't officially monitoring. The knowledge spread through networks of radio operators who understood that official doctrine and operational effectiveness didn't always align. By April 1943, an estimated 30 radio operators across the Atlantic Fleet were monitoring 468 kHz using modified equipment and Kovacs's correction techniques. By June, that number had reached 70. None of this appeared in official communications. No technical orders were issued. No doctrine was modified. But convoy escorts were detecting U-boat transmissions the enemy thought were undetectable, and Wolfpack coordination was becoming less effective because the Allies could hear conversations the Germans believed were secure. The Germans noticed. Kriegsmarine intelligence reports from mid-1943 noted that Allied convoys were avoiding Wolfpack formations with suspicious frequency, suggesting the Allies had developed improved detection capabilities. German submarines began minimizing radio use, even on frequencies they'd considered secure, which degraded coordination between boats and reduced Wolfpack effectiveness. The tactical advantage submarines had enjoyed through surface coordination was eroding, and German naval command couldn't determine why. The answer, that an American radio operator had figured out how to monitor frequencies the Germans thought were safe, wasn't something German intelligence could easily discover because it wasn't official Allied doctrine. It was improvisation that had spread through informal networks and unofficial adoption, existing in the operational gap between what institutions approved and what practitioners actually did. By August 1943, Kovacs's medium-wave direction-finding technique had contributed to avoiding submarine contact for an estimated 41 convoys. The number of successful Wolfpack attacks in the North Atlantic had dropped from an average of 2.7 per week in late 1942 to 0.8 per week in mid-1943. Not all of that improvement was attributable to medium-wave detection. The Allies had also increased air coverage, improved radar, and deployed more escort vessels. But Kovacs's contribution was measurable. Convoys with radio operators trained in his techniques experienced 63% fewer submarine encounters than convoys with standard equipment and procedures. The institutional Navy eventually acknowledged reality. In September 1943, the Bureau of Ships issued Technical Bulletin 43-09, authorizing supplemental medium-wave monitoring for submarine detection purposes using enhanced direction-finding configurations. The bulletin included specifications for antenna modifications, propagation correction procedures, and operational guidelines, all reverse-engineered from Kovacs's improvised methods. The bulletin didn't mention Kovacs by name. It credited field experimentation by operational personnel and presented the techniques as if they'd emerged from systematic institutional research rather than unauthorized tinkering by a single radio operator who decided the technical manuals were incomplete. The true operational validation of Kovacs's technique came during the winter of 1943-44, when the Battle of the Atlantic reached its decisive phase. By December 1943, approximately 140 radio operators across the Atlantic Fleet had been trained in medium-wave direction, finding using Kovacs's methods. The training was still informal, no official school, no standardized curriculum, but the knowledge had spread through networks of communications personnel who understood that detecting U-boats on frequencies the enemy considered secure provided tactical advantage worth the effort of learning techniques the manual said were unreliable. The Germans were adapting. Kriegsmarine analysts had concluded that Allied detection capabilities had improved significantly, though they couldn't determine exactly how. U-boat commanders received new operational directives in January 1944. Minimize all radio transmissions. Use brief-coded bursts when communication was essential. Assume the Allies could detect transmissions on any frequency. The directive didn't specifically mention medium-wave bands because German intelligence still believed those frequencies were too unreliable for Allied operational use. That assumption cost them dearly. On February 17, 1944, convoy HX-280 was crossing the mid-Atlantic Gap with 49 merchant ships and 7 escorts. Radio operator First Class James Chen, trained by Kovacs 3 months earlier, detected U-boat coordination transmissions on 468 kHz from 2 distinct bearings, one ahead of the convoy, one to the north. The transmissions were brief, exactly as the new German protocols specified, but Chen's modified equipment and trained interpretation caught them anyway. The escort commander, Captain Robert Winters aboard HMS Broke, faced the same decision Fisher had faced 14 months earlier: trust intelligence from non-standard sources or maintain course and hope for the best. Winters trusted it. HX-280 altered course to the south, away from both detected bearings. The convoy encountered no submarines. A patrol aircraft the following day spotted 4 U-boats on the surface 70 miles north of the convoy's altered track, exactly where the Wolfpack had positioned itself for an attack that never materialized. 4 U-boats deterred. 49 merchant ships delivered intact. Approximately 3,200 crew members who survived because a radio operator heard transmissions the enemy thought were undetectable. The pattern repeated throughout the winter. Convoys with trained medium-wave operators avoided contacts, altered courses based on early warning, and reached port with lower loss rates than convoys using standard detection methods alone. The statistical evidence became overwhelming. Between December 1943 and May 1944, convoys with medium-wave trained radio operators experienced submarine attacks 47% less frequently than convoys without that capability. When attacks did occur, the trained operators often detected wolfpack coordination early enough to allow convoy dispersal or escort reinforcement before the attack developed fully. The operational impact was measured in ships not sunk, cargo delivered, and sailors who came home. The Admiralty's submarine tracking room in London noticed the pattern. Their analysts compiled data from convoy reports, escort commander assessments, and U-boat activity estimates. The conclusion, documented in a classified report dated June 1944, was direct. Medium-wave radio intercept capability provides early warning of submarine concentrations, enabling tactical avoidance or preemptive response. Recommend expansion of training and equipment modification across all Atlantic escort forces. But expansion required resources, institutional commitment, and acknowledgement that an improvised technique developed by a single enlisted operator had proven more effective than officially sanctioned detection methods. That acknowledgement came slowly, grudgingly, through bureaucratic language that avoided admitting anyone had been wrong about medium-wave frequencies being operationally useless. The official narrative that emerged was carefully constructed. Faced with evolving German tactics, operational personnel developed innovative detection methods through field experimentation. These methods, after evaluation and validation, were incorporated into standard procedures. The system had worked, problems were identified, solutions were developed, improvements were implemented. The narrative emphasized institutional flexibility and operational adaptation. What the narrative omitted was that the Navy had initially prohibited the very techniques that proved decisive, that radio operators had violated regulations to develop those techniques, that convoy commanders had made career-risking decisions to trust intelligence from unauthorized sources, that the solution had spread through informal networks despite institutional resistance, not because of institutional support. The actual history, improvisation, succeeding where doctrine had failed, was less flattering than the official version where the system adapted smoothly to emerging challenges. Kovacs received the Navy Cross in July 1944, presented by Admiral Royal Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the detection of enemy submarine formations, enabling tactical decisions that prevented attacks on Allied convoys and preserved vital maritime supply lines. His initiative in developing innovative radio direction finding techniques and training operational personnel in their application represents the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service." The citation didn't mention that the innovative techniques had been developed in violation of regulations, that the equipment modifications had been unauthorized, or that Kovacs had been formally reprimanded before being commended. Institutional. Memory preferred heroes who worked within the system, not heroes who succeeded by ignoring it. By August 1944, medium-wave direction finding was standard capability on Atlantic convoy escorts. The technique Kovacs had developed using borrowed equipment in personal experimentation was now formalized in training manuals, equipment specifications, and operational doctrine. New radio operators learned medium-wave monitoring as part of basic training, using approved antenna configurations and standardized correction procedures. The improvised solution had become institutionalized procedure. The Germans finally understood what was happening in September 1944, when a U-boat was captured intact with its radio equipment and code books. Allied interrogation of the crew revealed that German submarines had been using 468 kilohertz for tactical coordination, specifically because they believed that frequency was beyond Allied monitoring capability. The prisoners were surprised to learn the Allies had been listening for 18 months. German naval intelligence had made accurate assessments of Allied standard capabilities, but had failed to anticipate that individual operators might develop non-standard capabilities through unauthorized innovation. The tactical advantage medium-wave detection had provided began eroding once the Germans understood it existed. U-boats shifted to even lower frequencies, used different transmission protocols, minimized radio coordination entirely, but the damage was done. The period from November 1942 to August 1944, when Kovacs's technique was spreading through informal networks and providing early warning the Germans didn't know the Allies possessed, coincided with the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boat effectiveness declined, convoy losses dropped, and the strategic balance shifted from attritional stalemate to Allied advantage. Quantifying Kovacs's specific contribution was impossible. Too many variables, too many other factors contributing to Allied success. But one calculation was possible. Between November 1942 and August 1944, 89 convoys altered course based on medium-wave radio intercepts that detected Wolfpack coordination transmissions. Those convoys represented 3,247 merchant ships and approximately 178,000 crew members. Historical loss rates for convoys encountering Wolfpacks without early warning averaged 16%. 16% of 3,247 was 520 ships. 89 convoys avoided because one radio operator decided the technical manuals were incomplete and spent 3 weeks proving it. The war ended in August 1945. By that time, medium-wave direction finding had evolved from Kovacs's improvised technique into standardized procedure taught to every radio operator in the Atlantic Fleet. The antenna modifications he'd developed in secret were now specified in technical manuals. The propagation correction methods he'd figured out through trial and error were formalized into lookup tables and calculation procedures. The frequency he'd monitored in violation of regulations was now an assigned monitoring band with dedicated equipment and trained operators. Michael Kovacs returned to civilian life in November 1945 with an honorable discharge, a Navy Cross, and a service record noting exceptional performance in technical innovation and operational training. He enrolled at the University of Illinois on the GI Bill to study electrical engineering, specifically because he wanted to understand the theoretical foundations of the radio propagation phenomena he'd learned to exploit through practical experimentation. His undergraduate thesis, completed in 1949, was titled Ionospheric Propagation Characteristics of Medium-Wave Radio Frequencies, Implications for Maritime Direction Finding. The thesis examined why medium waves had been considered unreliable for naval operations, explained the propagation mechanisms that caused bearing errors, and demonstrated correction methods that made tactical direction finding operationally viable. The thesis was technically sophisticated, mathematically rigorous, and read by approximately 15 people. His thesis committee, a few graduate students, and nobody else who mattered. What the thesis didn't discuss was that Kovacs had developed the correction methods before he understood the theory explaining why they worked. He'd built modified antennas based on intuition about signal behavior, tested bearing accuracy through empirical measurement, and created correction procedures through iterative refinement. The theoretical understanding came later, after the techniques were already saving convoys. The academic establishment preferred the opposite sequence, theory predicting application, which was why Kovacs's approach had been rejected by institutional authorities who valued methodology over results. Kovacs joined RCA in 1950 as a radio engineer working on commercial marine communications equipment. His reputation within the company was solid but unremarkable. A competent engineer who understood practical constraints and delivered functional designs without dramatic innovation. His colleagues knew he'd served on a cruiser during the war. None knew he'd developed the detection technique that helped turn the Battle of the Atlantic. It wasn't a secret Kovacs was keeping. It simply wasn't something that came up in conversation about commercial radio equipment for merchant shipping. The official history of Allied anti-submarine warfare, published by the Admiralty in 1954, devoted 2 paragraphs to medium wave direction finding. Operational personnel developed supplemental radio monitoring techniques using frequencies initially considered unsuitable for maritime direction finding. These techniques, after field validation, were incorporated into standard detection procedures. The innovation demonstrated the value of operational experience in identifying tactical opportunities. Kovacs' name appeared in a footnote crediting RO2M Kovacs, USS Boise, with initial development of medium-wave detection methodology. The U.S. Navy's official history, published in 1956, was slightly more detailed but equally sanitized. It acknowledged that medium-wave direction finding had provided early warning of submarine formations, credited innovative thinking by communications personnel, and noted that the technique had contributed to reduced convoy losses in 1943–44. The history didn't mention that the technique had been developed in violation of regulations, that it had spread through informal networks despite institutional prohibition, or that convoy commanders had risked their careers trusting intelligence from unauthorized sources. The veterans remembered differently. Radio operators who'd learned Kovacs' techniques kept in touch through informal networks that evolved into amateur radio clubs and Navy communications associations. At their gatherings, conversations turned to the Atlantic crossing, the convoys that didn't encounter wolf packs, the transmissions detected on frequencies that officially didn't work for submarine hunting. Kovacs' name came up in those conversations, not as a historical figure, but as the guy who'd figured out something important and shared it with anyone willing to learn. In 1967, a naval historian named Commander David Walsh began researching medium-wave direction, finding for a book about technical innovation in World War II. He tracked down convoy reports, escort commander assessments, and eventually found Kovacs living in New Jersey working for RCA. The interview Walsh conducted ran 6 hours across 2 days. Kovacs described the problem, the improvised solution, the institutional resistance, and the underground adoption that made the technique operationally significant, despite never being officially approved until after it had proven effective. Walsh asked the question that defined every conversation about wartime innovation. How did it feel to have saved thousands of lives through work that was initially prohibited and officially unrecognized? Kovacs' answer was characteristic. I didn't save anyone. I detected radio transmissions using equipment that worked better than people expected. Convoy commanders made the decisions. Escort crews fought the battles. Merchant sailors survived because lots of people did their jobs well. I just found a frequency that nobody else was listening to and figured out how to make the signals useful. That's not heroism. That's radio operation. Walsh's book, published in 1970, devoted an entire chapter to Kovacs' contribution. The book sold modestly, a few thousand copies to military history enthusiasts and naval veterans, but it established Kovacs' story in the historical record with proper documentation and context. Academic journals began referencing his work. A few engineering textbooks included case studies about practical problem-solving that challenged institutional assumptions. Kovacs became a footnote in the broader story of World War II, not famous but at least accurately remembered. The Navy recognized Kovacs' contribution more formally in 1978 by establishing the Michael Kovacs Award for Communications Innovation, presented annually to enlisted communications personnel who developed practical solutions to operational challenges. Kovacs attended the first award ceremony, gave a brief speech emphasizing that institutional rules existed for good reasons, but shouldn't prevent people from testing whether those rules captured all possible solutions, and never spoke publicly about his wartime service again. He retired from RCA in 1982 after 32 years of steady engineering work on commercial communication systems. He'd contributed to marine radio design, consulted on direction-finding equipment for civilian vessels, and reviewed countless proposals from younger engineers trying to solve problems through elegant complexity when simpler approaches might work better. His reputation within RCA was as a practical engineer who could evaluate elaborate solutions and identify whether they actually solved problems or just demonstrated technical sophistication. Kovacs died in 1998 at age 76. His obituary in the Newark Star-Ledger identified him as retired RCA engineer, Navy Cross recipient, and World War II veteran. A longer obituary in a Navy veterans publication provided more context. His development of medium-wave radio direction-finding techniques during Atlantic convoy operations contributed to the detection of enemy submarine formations and the protection of Allied maritime supply lines. His willingness to challenge institutional assumptions about technical limitations exemplified the practical problem-solving that characterized the greatest generation's approach to seemingly impossible challenges. The modified loop antenna Kovacs had built in 1942, the one that detected transmissions on 468 kHz when official equipment couldn't, was preserved in exactly one location, the National Cryptologic Museum at Fort Meade, Maryland. The museum acquired it in 1985 from a Navy Archives review that discovered the antenna in storage with documentation noting its historical significance. The exhibit placard reads, "Direction Finding Antenna Modified by RO2 Michael Kovacs, USS Boise, 1942. This equipment enabled detection of enemy submarine radio transmissions on frequencies previously considered unsuitable for maritime operations. The technique developed using this antenna contributed to the avoidance of submarine attacks by an estimated 89 Allied convoys during 1942-1944. Three numbers tell the story. 89 convoys that altered course based on medium-wave intercepts, 3,047 merchant ships in those convoys, 520 ships that would statistically have been lost if the convoys had encountered wolf packs without early warning. Those numbers represent the gap between institutional doctrine and operational reality, between what formal procedures could accomplish and what improvisation achieved. Kovacs understood that gap instinctively, probably from growing up watching factory workers troubleshoot equipment that didn't behave the way engineering drawings predicted. The institutional Navy eventually acknowledged he was right. But institutional acknowledgement came 18 months after Kovacs had proven it through unauthorized experimentation, and recognition came decades after the contribution had been made. The radio operators who learned his techniques knew. The convoy commanders who trusted his intercepts knew. The merchant sailors who survived because their ships didn't encounter wolf packs never knew why their convoys had altered course or what intelligence had prompted those decisions. But they survived. And survival mattered more than recognition, more than institutional validation, more than whether anyone remembered who'd made it possible. Thanks for watching this story about Michael Kovacs and the forbidden frequency that saved 89 convoys from U-boat attacks. If this resonated with you, hit that like button. It helps the channel reach people who appreciate stories about challenging institutional assumptions with practical results. What strikes me about Kovacs' story is how often the most effective solutions exist just outside the boundaries of what institutional authorities consider possible. Medium wave direction finding wasn't impossible. It was just complicated enough that official doctrine dismissed it rather than figuring out how to make it work. Tell us in the comments, have you ever found a solution in a place experts said was pointless to look? Let us know where you're watching from. Subscribe for more untold WWII stories about individuals who changed outcomes by refusing to accept that difficult problems were impossible problems. New videos weekly.